rust. That was the primary flavor of the air on the lower decks of the freighter Pilgrim, followed closely by the acrid metallic tang of recycled breath and ozone. Beatrix cracked her neck, listening to the heavy, satisfying pop of her cervical vertebrae settling into place. She exhaled, a slow, rattling sound in the cramped corridor. She was a native of Acheron. To the bureaucratic pencil pushers of the galactic core, her homeworld was classified as a Category 9 Deathworld. To Beatrix, it was simply where you learned to keep your eyes open and your back to a wall. Acheron had gravity that could compress a lesser being's spine into gravel, atmospheric pressure that felt like wearing a wet lead blanket, and a native biosphere where even the moss actively tried to dissolve your boots. Because of this, Beatrix walked through the galaxy with a quiet, undeniable arrogance. It wasn't malice. It was just biology. She was denser, faster, and infinitely harder to kill than anyone else on the Pilgrim. Her crewmates were fragile. Joseph, the ship's pilot, possessed hollow bones and skin so thin you could see the blue pulse of his veins if the lighting was too harsh. Chloe, the chief engineer, was brilliant, but required a pressurized environmental suit just to keep her internal organs from rupturing in standard gravity. Beatrix spent her days constantly moderating her strength, treating the ship and everyone on it like spun glass. She was the heavy lifter, the bodyguard, the one who stepped into the dark when the sensors pinged something hostile. She was the apex predator in a tin can full of prey. It was exhausting. It was intensely lonely. Then they picked up a new hired gun at the trading post on Persephone Station. A human. His name was Miller. Beatrix stood by the airlock when he boarded, her heavy arms crossed over her chest. The docking clamps disengaged with a cavernous groan, and the pressure doors hissed apart, spitting out a cloud of sanitized station air. Miller stepped through. Beatrix's first reaction was a profound, almost insulting sense of disappointment. He was bipedal, standing a few inches shorter than her. He lacked the chitinous dermal plating she possessed, and he didn't have the secondary muscle clusters visible beneath his clothes. In fact, his skin looked ridiculously soft. A pale, pinkish beige stretched tight over a skeletal structure that seemed utterly unremarkable. He wore a faded canvas jacket, stained with grease, and heavy synthetic boots. He dropped his canvas duffel bag onto the deck grating. It hit with a dense, ugly thud that suggested it weighed more than Joseph's entire body. Beatrix flared her nostrils, pulling in his scent. It was a chaotic mess. Stale sweat, the bitter oil of roasted coffee beans, a sharp undertone of peppermint, and something faintly chemical like cured leather. He smelled loud. "You the welcome committee?" Miller asked. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that didn't match his soft exterior. He was chewing on something, his jaw working in a slow, rhythmic circle. "I am the security chief," Beatrix said, her voice dropping an octave, a subconscious display of dominance. "My name is Beatrix. You will follow my protocols. You will not touch the environmental controls. You will stay out of the lower engineering bays unless accompanied by me." Miller didn't flinch. He didn't offer a submissive, throat-baring gesture, nor did he puff out his chest in a challenge. He just scratched the back of his neck, leaving a red welt on his own fragile skin from his fingernails. "Sure thing, boss," he muttered, picking up his bag with one hand. Beatrix watched the tendons in his forearm snap taut. The bag had to be 80 pounds, but he hoisted it like it was filled with laundry. He walked past her, his boots striking the metal deck with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. Beatrix frowned, the thick ridges above her eyes knitting together. There was no hesitation in his step. Standard gravity didn't seem to affect him, which meant he wasn't from a low-mass colony, but he looked so terribly breakable. She decided right then that she would have to babysit him, just like she babysat Joseph and Chloe, another fragile thing to keep alive in the dark. She had no idea how spectacularly wrong she was. Vibrations travel differently through a ship when something goes catastrophically wrong. It isn't a sound, it's a feeling. It starts in the soles of your feet, a violent, jagged shudder that knocks the rhythm of your heart out of sync. Beatrix felt it while she was in the mess hall. The lights flickered, buzzing furiously, before dropping into the sickly amber hue of emergency power. A second later, the ship's internal comms shrieked. "Cargo Bay 4!" Chloe's voice was pure static and panic. "Gravity dampeners failed. The mooring lines—" Beatrix was already moving. She hit the corridor at a sprint, her heavy footfalls leaving shallow dents in the floor plating. The air in the lower decks was already growing hot, carrying the bitter, toxic smell of melting polymer and vaporized hydraulic fluid. She slammed the manual release for Cargo Bay 4, hauling the heavy blast doors apart with raw shoulder strength. The scene inside was chaos. The dampener grid had shorted out, meaning the localized gravity was violently fluctuating. Worse, a 3-ton iridium manifold, a massive jagged chunk of raw engine machinery, had snapped its carbon fiber restraints. It was sliding across the deck, tearing up sparks like a grinding wheel, heading straight for the lower control booth where Joseph was curled under a console, paralyzed by the noise. Beatrix calculated the distance. She calculated the mass of the manifold. She knew she could intercept it. It would shatter her left forearm, maybe break a few ribs, but her dense bone structure would hold long enough to deflect it away from Joseph. She took a breath, bracing her legs, preparing to accept the agony. A blur of faded canvas shot past her. Miller. He hadn't calculated anything. He didn't pause to weigh the physics or the biological cost. He just threw himself into the gap between the sliding manifold and the booth. "Miller, no!" Beatrix roared, her voice tearing at her throat. He was too soft. The iridium would crush his pelvis into dust and smear him against the bulkhead. Miller slammed his boots into the deck grating, wedging his back against the reinforced strut of the booth, and shoved his hands directly against the moving face of the manifold. The sound was nauseating. It was a wet, heavy crunch of yielding biology meeting unyielding physics. Beatrix watched in sheer horror. She saw the fabric of Miller's jacket tear as the jagged metal bit into his shoulder. She smelled the sudden, overwhelming stench of searing meat. The manifold was superheated from friction. But the manifold stopped. It stopped because Miller was screaming. It wasn't a scream of pain, though the pain must have been absolute. It was a primal, guttural roar of sheer defiance. His jaw was locked, the veins in his neck bulging so violently they looked like black worms beneath his skin. Beatrix's eyes widened. She was a Deathworlder. She understood biology. What she was looking at was impossible. Miller didn't have the muscle mass to halt 3 tons of sliding metal, but his body was doing it anyway. He was tearing his own muscle fibers to shreds, redlining his central nervous system, bypassing every built-in safety limitation his brain possessed. He was destroying himself to hold the line. "Get him out," Miller choked, his voice a gargling rasp. Blood, bright and terrifyingly red, began to drip from his nose, painting his lips. The smell hit Beatrix, heavy with iron, sharp with adrenaline. It smelled like pure, distilled violence. Beatrix snapped out of her shock. She lunged forward, grabbing Joseph by his uniform and hurling the frail pilot out of the booth. The second Joseph was clear, Miller let go. He didn't leap away gracefully. He simply collapsed. The manifold ground forward another 2 feet, smashing into the booth exactly where he had been standing. But Miller had dropped like a stone, rolling weakly out of the crush zone. Beatrix stood over him, her chest heaving. The danger was over. The gravity grid hummed back to life, pinning the metal to the floor. She looked down at the human. His left arm hung at a sickening, impossible angle. His shoulder was a mangled mess of torn fabric, burned skin, and thick, pooling blood. A native of Acheron would have been incapacitated by the shock. A lesser species would be dead from the trauma. Miller coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the grating. He blinked slowly, looking up at Beatrix. His face was pale, slick with a cold sweat that smelled strongly of onions and fear. "Well," Miller wheezed, a pathetic, wet sound. "That sucked." Beatrix couldn't speak. Her hands were shaking. She had thought she was the apex predator on this ship, but as she looked at this soft, broken creature who had just shattered his own body on a whim and was now trying to make a joke, she realized something terrifying. He wasn't prey. He was something completely unhinged. Medical bays on deep space freighters are rarely comforting places. The Pilgrim's med bay was a cramped, sterile closet that perpetually smelled of bleach and old bandages. The ship's automated surgical dock, a multi-armed robotic contraption, hung dormant from the ceiling. It didn't have human anatomy in its database. Beatrix stood leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed tight to hide the faint tremor in her heavy fingers. Miller sat on the edge of the examination table. He had stripped off his ruined jacket and shirt. His torso was a map of old violence, faded white lines of surgical scars, a burn mark on his ribs, the jagged puckering of shrapnel wounds. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a crash test dummy that had survived. Currently, he was holding a bottle of high-proof engine solvent in his teeth, while he used his good hand to awkwardly thread a curved suturing needle. "Let me," Beatrix said. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. Miller paused, taking the bottle out of his mouth. "You know how to sew?" "I know how to close a wound." She stepped forward, dwarfing him as she approached. She took the needle and the heavy synthetic thread from his trembling hand. Up close, the damage was worse. The skin of his shoulder was blistered from the heat, and a deep laceration ran down to the muscle layer. Blood was still weeping from the edges. Beatrix poured the solvent onto a rag and pressed it against the wound. Miller flinched violently. He sucked air through his teeth, letting out a high, tight hiss. "Christ, go easy!" Beatrix paused, staring at him. The internal contradiction was giving her a headache. Less than an hour ago, this creature had voluntarily let a 3-ton slab of superheated metal crush his shoulder, and he had roared like a demon. Now he was wincing and complaining about the sting of an antiseptic wipe. "You make no sense," Beatrix muttered, driving the needle through the soft meat of his shoulder. She pulled the thread tight. Miller groaned, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "What's not to make sense of? It hurts. You did not care about the pain when you stopped the manifold." "I cared a lot," Miller corrected, breathing heavily through his nose. "I just didn't have time to complain about it right then. Priorities be..." She hated the nickname, but let it slide. She tied off a knot, snapping the thread with her teeth. "Your biology, it is flawed. You do not have the structural density to stop that kind of mass. Your brain should have paralyzed your motor functions to prevent catastrophic tissue damage, but you bypassed it. Why? Miller looked down at his lap. He reached out with his good hand and picked up a small plastic bottle he had brought with him. He squeezed a few drops of thick, dark red liquid onto his thumb, then licked it off. Beatrix caught the scent immediately. Capsaicin, a chemical irritant. On Acheron, a derivative of that compound was used in riot control grenades. He was eating it for comfort. It's an adrenaline response, Miller said quietly. Humans, we evolved on a pretty rough rock, Earth. I have not heard of it, Beatrix said, beginning to wrap a compression bandage over the stitches. Not surprised. We're out in the boonies, but yeah, Earth. Gravity is about a full G. Not as heavy as your world, probably. But we got weather. Hurricanes that wipe out coastlines. Earthquakes that split cities open. We've got microorganisms that eat you from the inside out. Miller chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. We have apex predators that weigh 600 pounds and run faster than cars. You know what we did with them? Beatrix finished securing the bandage. She looked him in the eye. You hunted them to extinction? No, Miller smiled. It was a terrifying expression because it was entirely genuine. We domesticated them. We keep them in our houses. We let them sleep at the foot of our beds. Beatrix felt a cold prickle crawl up her spine. The scales along her neck flattened out, an ancient, primitive prey response she hadn't felt since she was a child on Acheron, hiding from night stalkers in the toxic mud. Your species is insane, she stated flatly. Nah, just stubborn, Miller replied, rolling his good shoulder. Our bodies are soft, yeah. We don't have armor or claws. So our evolution gave us a workaround. When things get bad, our brains dump a cocktail of hormones into our bloodstream. It shuts off the pain receptors. It turns off the safety limiters on our muscles. We break our own bones and tear our own ligaments just to squeeze out a few extra seconds of raw strength. It's called hysterical strength. We literally burn ourselves alive from the inside out just to win. He grabbed his bloody, ruined shirt from the floor. We're not built to take hits, B. We're built to survive them anyway. Beatrix took a step back. She looked at the blood on her hands. Human blood. It tasted like copper and smelled like defiance. She had spent her entire life thinking she was the hardest thing in the void because she came from a world that tried to crush her. But Miller came from a world that had taught him to crush himself just to spite the universe. She wasn't the only Deathworlder on the Pilgrim. She wasn't even the most dangerous one. Rest, Beatrix commanded softly, her tone entirely stripped of its former arrogance. Do not touch the environmental controls, and if you need anything, calm me. Miller gave her a tired, lopsided salute. Yes, ma'am. Beatrix walked out of the medbay, the heavy metal doors hissing shut behind her. The corridor was quiet again. She listened to the hum of the ship's engines, feeling the familiar, grinding fatigue in her dense muscles. But for the first time since she had boarded this flying tin can, the weight of the dark didn't feel so heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't alone in the dark anymore. Chewing synthetic rations sounded exactly like grinding wet cardboard between your molars. Beatrix sat in the dim, humming quiet of the galley, pushing a gray, gelatinous cube around her metal tray. Her heavy brow was furrowed. Across the narrow table, Miller was dissecting his own portion with a serrated survival knife. He had been on board for 3 days since the incident in Cargo Bay 4. By Acheron medical standards, he should have been immobilized in a nutrient bath. Instead, He had bound his left arm tight to his ribs, using what looked like industrial-grade structural tape. He moved stiffly, favoring his right side, and his skin had bloomed into a horrifying palette of purples, sickly yellows, and deep, necrotic-looking blacks. He smelled strongly of synthesized iodine and unwashed canvas. "You are leaking," Beatrix pointed out. A thin line of crimson was seeping through his shirt where the tape bit into his collarbone. Miller looked down, dabbed a finger at the blood, and wiped it on his pants. "Stitches pulled a little when I was torquing the coupling on the port thruster. You should not be torquing anything." "Chloe needed a hand," he mumbled around a mouthful of ration paste. He didn't seem to care that it tasted like salted dust. "Joseph's too light to turn the wrench, and you were asleep." Beatrix set her fork down. The metal clanged sharply against the tray. She hated the logic, but more than that, she hated the unsettling realization that she was no longer the sole load-bearing pillar on this ship. Before she could articulate her frustration, the deck lurched violently. It wasn't a mechanical failure this time. It was an external kinetic impact. The galley lights died instantly, plunging them into absolute darkness for a 3-second eternity before the red emergency strips flared to life along the baseboards. The ship's klaxon began a rhythmic, ear-splitting shriek. "Hull breach," Joseph's voice cracked over the comms, pitched so high it was almost ultrasonic. "We've been snagged. Tether harpoons, port side. They're pulling us in." "Who?" Beatrix barked, already out of her seat. "Scrappers, skittercast. Their transponder is spoofed, but it's a raider rig. They're cutting through airlock 3. Beatrix felt the familiar heavy drop of adrenaline pooling in her gut. Scrappers. Desperate, heavily augmented scavengers that moved in swarms, cutting ships apart while the crews were still breathing to harvest their organs and cybernetics. "Lock down the engineering bay," she ordered. "Joseph, vent the port corridors. Starve them of oxygen." "I can't. They overrode the environmental seals when the harpoons punched through the hull," Beatrix cursed in her native tongue, a guttural sound like cracking stones. She turned to the weapons locker bolted to the bulkhead. She punched in her biometric code, ripping the heavy door open, and pulled out her kinetic slug thrower. It was a massive, brutal weapon designed for Acheron's dense atmosphere. It kicked with enough force to shatter a standard human's collarbone. When she turned around, Miller was standing there. He hadn't grabbed a gun. He had walked over to the galley's maintenance panel, ripped it off the wall with his good hand, and pulled out a meter-long titanium breaker bar. It was slick with old grease and heavy enough to crack a skull. "Get back to the med bay," Beatrix snarled, racking a slug into the chamber. "You are injured. You will be a liability." Miller didn't argue. He just stood there, his eyes adjusting to the red emergency light. His pupils were dilated. He was breathing through his nose, slow and even. The smell of fear and onions she had noticed days ago was gone. He smelled like cold iron and sweat. "Airlock 3 is adjacent to the main life support manifold," Miller said quietly. "They blow that. We all suffocate in 20 minutes. You take the main corridor. I'll take the ventilation shafts. Flank them." "You have one arm," Beatrix yelled over the klaxon. "Yeah," Miller grunted, hefting the titanium bar. "Good thing I only need one to swing this. See you at the airlock, B." He didn't wait for permission. He slipped out the secondary hatch, moving with a silent, terrifying urgency. Beatrix didn't have time to stop him. She took off down the primary corridor. The air grew rapidly colder, smelling of ozone, burning plasma, and the sharp ammonia tang of the skittercast. She rounded the corner just as the inner door of airlock 3 gave way in a shower of molten slag. They poured in like roaches. 6 of them, clad in scavenged, rusted pressure suits, their multi-jointed limbs clicking against the floor plating. They carried plasma torches and jagged projectile rifles. Beatrix didn't hesitate. She planted her heavy boots, bracing her dense skeleton, and squeezed the trigger. The slug thrower roared, a concussive blast of sound that shook dust from the ceiling overhead. The lead scrapper essentially evaporated from the chest up, its chitinous armor shattering like cheap glass. The remaining 5 shrieked, scattering into the shadows and returning fire. Searing bolts of plasma splashed against the bulkhead inches from Beatrix's head, melting the metal into glowing slag. She moved forward, a slow, unstoppable juggernaut, firing again. Another scrapper went down, its legs sheared off at the joints, but they were fast, too fast. One of them scurried up the wall, using magnetic clamps, lining up a shot directly at the unprotected back of Beatrix's neck. Before it could pull the trigger, the overhead ventilation grate blew out. Miller dropped from the ceiling. He didn't yell. He didn't make a sound. He landed squarely on the scrapper's back, the combined weight tearing its magnetic clamps from the wall. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Beatrix watched in morbid fascination. Miller didn't fight with the precise, practiced strikes of a trained soldier. He fought like a street dog. He drove the titanium breaker bar down like a piston, smashing the scrapper's weapon arm. The alien shrieked, thrashing wildly, its sharp mandibles snapping at Miller's face. Miller just leaned his weight onto his injured left shoulder, using his own taped broken arm to pin the creature's head to the deck. He ignored the agonizing pop of his own stitches tearing. With a grunt of raw, ugly exertion, he brought the heavy titanium bar down repeatedly. Bone cracked, chitin splintered, thick blue hemolymph splashed across his pale skin. He didn't stop until the creature stopped moving. Beatrix put a kinetic slug through the chest of the final scrapper, dropping it instantly. Silence slammed back into the corridor, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the ragged, wet sound of Miller gasping for air. He stood up, wiping a smear of blue alien blood from his cheek. He looked at Beatrix, his face utterly void of emotion. 3 down, he said, his voice hoarse. How many more on their ship? Beatrix stared at him. She looked at the pulverized remains of the scrapper at his feet. A profound creeping dread settled in her gut. She had brought a weapon. He had brought a tool. And yet, looking at him now, she knew exactly which one of them was the predator. Lactic acid burned like liquid fire through Beatrix's veins. Her dense musculature, evolved for explosive, earth-shattering bursts of power under extreme gravity, was not designed for this. Aerobic endurance was the biological tax Acheron natives paid for their strength. After 20 minutes of sustained, high-intensity combat, clearing corridor after corridor of skitter-cast boarding parties, she was drowning in her own exhaustion. Her breathing was a ragged, whistling sound. Her heart hammered against her thick ribs, struggling to pump oxygen through her dense, heavy tissues. She leaned against the scorched bulkhead near the entrance to the lower engineering deck, her slug thrower feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Beside her, Miller was reloading a scavenged projectile rifle. Beatrix turned her head, squinting through the stinging sweat in her eyes. It defied logic. Miller looked like walking death. His makeshift bandages were soaked through with fresh, bright red blood. He was missing a chunk of flesh from his right calf, where a scrapper had grazed him with a cutting torch. His skin was pale and slick with a thick, unceasing layer of sweat. yet his breathing was steady. In, out, like a metronome. "Why are you not collapsing?" Beatrix rasped, her throat raw. Miller snapped a fresh magazine into the rifle and checked the chamber. He didn't look up. "Sweat glands. We have millions of them. We offload heat through evaporation. Keeps the engine from redlining. Plus, we're pursuit hunters. On Earth, early humans didn't chase prey down by being faster. We just jogged after them for hours until they died of heat stroke and exhaustion. We are biologically built to walk things to death." Beatrix stared at him. The smell of his sweat was overpowering now, sharp, salty, and thick with cortisol. She realized he wasn't immune to the fatigue. He was feeling it. Every torn muscle, every bleeding wound, every bruised bone was screaming at him to lie down and die. He was simply ignoring it. A massive concussive boom echoed from down the corridor. The heavy blast doors leading to the engineering bay groaned inward, the metal glowing cherry red along the seams. "They are breaching engineering," Beatrix said, forcing herself to stand upright. Her legs trembled violently. "Chloe is in there." "Then we move," Miller said. They rounded the corner into the main causeway. The skittercast had brought up a heavy breaching rig, a portable fusion cutter clamped to the door. Manning it was the boarding party's leader. It was twice the size of a normal scrapper, heavily augmented with stolen hydraulic limbs and thick plates of salvaged hull armor, bolted directly to its carapace. 4 smaller scrappers guarded the perimeter. "I cannot breach that armor," Beatrix panted, checking her slug thrower. "I have 2 rounds left. It will barely dent that plating." "You don't need to," Miller said. He pointed toward the ceiling directly above the fusion cutter. A cluster of thick, insulated pipes ran along the ceiling, primary coolant lines for the ship's FTL drive. "Take out the guards. Give me a clear path." "A path to what?" Beatrix demanded. "If you try to bludgeon that thing, it will cut you in half." Miller didn't answer. He just dropped his scavenged rifle, pulled out his titanium breaker bar, and sprinted straight down the corridor. It was a suicide charge, the absolute absence of self-preservation. Beatrix roared, a sound of pure Acheron fury, and stepped out from cover. She fired her last 2 slugs, blowing the center mass out of 2 of the smaller guards. The thunderous noise drew the attention of the massive leader. It turned its ugly, multi-eyed head toward her, raising a heavy plasma cannon bolted to its right arm. It completely ignored Miller. To the alien sensors, Miller was an unarmored, slow-moving, unarmed piece of meat. Irrelevant. That was its fatal mistake. Miller didn't aim for the leader. As he closed the distance, he planted his boot on the chest of a dead scrapper, using it as a springboard. He launched himself upward, ignoring the searing heat radiating from the fusion cutter below. He swung the titanium bar overhead and smashed it directly into the FTL coolant junction valve above the leader's head. The valve didn't just break, it detonated. Super-chilled liquid nitrogen and pressurized freon exploded downward in a massive, blinding white cloud. The temperature in the corridor instantly plummeted by 200 degrees. The skittercast leader shrieked, a metallic scraping sound, as the cryogenic fluid washed over its body. Alien biology, adapted for warm environments, immediately seized. The joints of its hydraulic limbs frosted over and locked solid. Its chitinous armor cracked under the rapid thermal shock. But Miller was caught in the blast, too. Beatrix watched in horror as the human plummeted from the pipe, crashing onto the deck grid beside the frozen alien. His clothes were instantly frosted stiff. Frostbite began to instantly blacken the edges of his ears and his fingertips. He shouldn't have been able to move. His nervous system should have shut down from the traumatic temperature drop. But Miller rolled over. His teeth were chattering so violently it sounded like static. His face was blue, and his lips were split and bleeding. He gripped his titanium bar with hands that looked like blocks of ice. The skitter leader, paralyzed but still alive, watched him with wide, multifaceted eyes. Miller dragged himself forward, his boots scraping weakly against the frozen deck. He crawled up onto the alien's chest, straddling its locked armor plates. He raised the titanium bar with both hands, his breath coming out in thick, white plumes. "Get off my ship," Miller whispered. The sound barely carried over the hiss of venting gas. He drove the bar down into the unprotected, fleshy gap between the alien's neck armor and its helmet. He pulled it out and drove it down again and again. He didn't stop until the creature's eyes went dark, and the blue hemolymph froze as quickly as it spilled out. Miller slumped forward, resting his forehead against the dead alien's cold armor. The breaker bar clattered to the deck. Beatrix staggered forward, her dense legs feeling like lead pillars. She reached the human, grabbing him by the back of his rigid, frozen jacket, and hauled him off the corpse. He was violently shivering, his body convulsing as it desperately burned whatever energy it had left to keep his core temperature from flatlining. She hoisted him over her shoulder. He felt heavier now, dense with dead weight and ice. "Miller," she said, her voice shaking. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeply primitive. "Miller, stay awake." "Cold," he mumbled, his jaw locked. "Really cold, B." "I know," she said, carrying him back toward the med bay, leaving the frozen slaughterhouse behind. "I know." She had read the galactic encyclopedias. She knew about death worlds. She knew about extreme gravity, toxic atmospheres, and hyper-lethal biospheres. But as she carried the shivering, broken human through the quiet corridors of the Pilgrim, she understood the truth. Earth wasn't a death world because of its weather or its predators. Earth was a death world because it produced things that simply refused to die. Thawing out is vastly more painful than freezing to death. Freezing is a slow, deceptive slide into numbness. The nervous system simply shuts its doors and windows, turning off the lights room by room until the house is empty. Thawing, however, is a violent eviction. As blood flow returns to constricted, nearly dead capillaries, the nerve endings wake up screaming. Beatrix stood over the medbay examination table, her heavy arms hanging at her sides. She watched Miller's body tear itself apart from the inside. He was strapped down. Joseph had insisted on the heavy synthetic restraints, terrified the human might convulse and break his own spine. Joseph hovered near the diagnostic monitor, his translucent hands hovering over the keypad, his large, dark eyes wide with an anxiety that bordered on nausea. Chloe, still encased in her pressurized environmental suit, stood in the corner, the quiet hum of her life support recyclers the only steady sound in the room. Miller thrashed against the straps. His teeth ground together with a sound like rocks in a tumbler. "His core temperature is rising, but it's too fast," Joseph stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "The cellular damage, the thermal shock should have triggered massive organ failure. I do not understand how his heart is still beating. It is skipping beats. It is practically vibrating." "Keep the thermal blankets on maximum," Beatrix ordered. Her voice was flat, betraying none of the deep, churning unease in her gut. She stared down at Miller. His skin was a horrifying canvas of damage. The frostbite had turned the tips of his fingers, his nose, and the edges of his ears a bruised, waxy yellow. Where the ice had melted, his flesh was flushed an angry, inflamed red, blistering and weeping clear fluid. The smell of the room was awful, a sickening mixture of sterile iodine, the copper stink of old blood from his torn shoulder, and the undeniable, sweetish rot of dying tissue. He looked pathetic. He looked like something dragged out of a gutter, chewed up by a predator, and spat back out. Suddenly, Miller's eyes snapped open. The sclera were violently bloodshot, the irises a pale fractured green. He drew in a ragged, gasping breath that rattled wetly in his chest. He strained against the thick restraints, the tendons in his neck pulling tight like steel cables beneath the inflamed skin. "Beatrix," he choked out. It wasn't a word, it was a wheeze. "I am here," she said, stepping closer. She placed one heavy, dense hand on his chest, right over his sternum. She didn't press down. Her resting weight was enough to pin him flat. "Stop fighting. The scrappers are dead. The ship is sealed. You are safe." Miller blinked, the frantic, panicked animal light slowly fading from his eyes. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that brought a fleck of blood to his split lips. "My hands," he whispered. "They feel like they're in boiling oil. Make it stop." "We cannot give you standard anesthetics," Joseph interjected from the console, his voice trembling. "Your biology is undocumented. Acheron pain blockers would stop your heart. Standard galactic sedatives might induce a permanent coma." Miller turned his head, looking at the ceiling. A slow, miserable tear leaked from the corner of his eye, cutting a clean track through the dirt and grease on his face. He didn't sob. He just breathed, slow and ragged, fighting a solitary war against his own nervous system. "Just give me a minute," Miller grated, his jaw clenched tight. "Just a minute." Beatrix removed her hand from his chest. She watched him ride out the agony. He didn't possess the dense, armored stoicism of her people, who were taught to swallow pain in absolute silence. Miller felt it. He hated it. He complained about it. Yet, he endured it with a stubborn, ugly refusal to break. After 10 minutes, the violent shivering subsided into faint, exhausted tremors. He slumped back against the table, completely spent. "Are you lucid?" Beatrix asked. Miller turned his head toward her. He offered a weak, lopsided smile that looked more like a grimace. "I've had better Tuesdays, B." "You destroyed the main coolant valve for the FTL drive," she stated. It wasn't an accusation, just a tactical summary. "You froze the boarding party leader. You also froze yourself. Did it work?" "Yes." "Then I'm claiming a tactical victory," he mumbled, closing his eyes. "And I'm definitely charging overtime." Beatrix crossed her arms. "You should be dead. Again. You possess zero structural integrity, yet you treat your body like disposable hardware. It is illogical. You are a biological paradox." "I told you," Miller whispered, his voice drifting as exhaustion finally dragged him under. "We're stubborn." Beatrix stood over him long after he passed out. Chloe shuffled forward in her heavy suit, her synthesized voice crackling over the external speaker. "Beatrix, he is right. The FTL is down. We are adrift." Beatrix turned her heavy gaze to the engineer. "Can you patch the coolant line?" "I can," Chloe replied, "but there is a secondary problem. The rapid thermal expansion from the liquid nitrogen warped the primary junction box in the subdeck. The manual bypass needs to be engaged, or the drive will never ignite. Then I will engage it." Chloe shook her head inside her helmet. "You cannot. The junction box is located inside the maintenance crawlspace beneath the main reactor. The access hatch is 40 centimeters wide. Your shoulders are twice that. You physically cannot fit. Beatrix frowned, her thick brow ridge lowering. Joseph, if I attempt to turn the manual override valve, my wrists will snap, the pilot said defensively. It requires at least 60 pounds of torque. My skeletal density is not rated for heavy manual labor. Beatrix looked slowly back down at the unconscious human on the table. His left arm was a mangled, taped-together mess. His body was ravaged by frostbite. He was currently running a fever that would cook a lesser being's brain. She felt a rare, deeply uncomfortable emotion twist in her gut. Guilt. No, Beatrix said softly. He cannot do it. He is broken. If we do not jump to hyperspace within 12 hours, the Skittercast mothership will track the distress beacon of their boarding party, Chloe said, her voice devoid of emotion. They will bring a swarm. We will all die. Beatrix looked at the cold steel of the deck. She looked at the blood on her boots. She was the heavy lifter. She was the apex predator. But in the claustrophobic, unforgiving geometry of a starship, raw strength meant nothing if it couldn't reach the problem. She needed the rat. She needed the creature that could squeeze into the dark, chew through the pain, and survive. The lower engineering deck felt like the inside of an oven. With the primary coolant lines ruptured, the ambient temperature near the reactor had climbed to 45 degrees Celsius. The air was thick, suffocating, and tasted entirely of ozone and burned copper. The ship's artificial gravity was dialed down to 20% to ease the strain on the failing power grid, making every movement feel floaty and nauseating. Miller stood in front of the maintenance access hatch. He was stripped to the waist, wearing only his grease-stained canvas trousers and heavy boots. His torso was wrapped tightly in fresh white bandages, already blooming with fresh red spots where his stitches protested his movements. His frostbitten fingers were wrapped in thick layer of synthetic medical tape, leaving only the tips exposed so he could grip the tools. He looked terrible. His skin was pale and slick with sweat, his breathing shallow. Beatrix stood behind him, holding a heavy utility flashlight. She felt entirely useless. The crawl space is 10 meters long, Chloe's voice crackled over the local comms from the control room. It is unventilated. The ambient temperature inside the tunnel is estimated at 60 degrees Celsius. You will have approximately 5 minutes before hyperthermia induces cognitive failure. Got it, Miller rasped. He coughed, spitting a glob of phlegm onto the grating. Slide in, turn the big red valve, slide out, piece of cake. You do not have to make light of it, Beatrix said, her voice a low, gravelly rumble. It is a suicide run. Miller paused, resting his forehead against the cool metal of the bulkhead for a brief second. He took a slow, deep breath, smelling of sweat, sickness, and raw determination. He looked back at Beatrix over his uninjured shoulder. B, if I don't go in there, those bugs come back and eat us. I don't really fancy being harvested for spare parts today. Your left arm is useless, she argued, pointing a heavy finger at his bound limb. Your core temperature is compromised. If you get stuck in that tunnel, I cannot pull you out. I cannot reach you. You will cook alive in the dark. Then I'd better not get stuck, Miller said simply. He grabbed the heavy titanium wrench from the toolkit at his feet. With a grunt of effort, he dropped to his knees, immediately wincing as the hard deck aggravated the burns on his legs. He awkwardly maneuvered himself into the tiny 40-centimeter opening. Beatrix shone the flashlight into the tunnel. It was a nightmare. A claustrophobic tube of corrugated metal, crisscrossed with heavy, insulated power cables that hummed with lethal voltage. The heat radiating from the shaft was a physical wall against her face. Miller slid forward, entirely on his stomach. He couldn't use his left arm, so he dragged himself forward, using only his right hand and his boots, pushing off the jagged metal flooring. Scrape, grunt, scrape, grunt. The sound echoed hollowly in the tunnel. Beatrix watched his boots slowly disappear into the gloom. The smell of his sweat drifted back to her, cooking in the intense heat of the confined space. 3 meters, Chloe's voice counted down. Heart rate is elevating rapidly, core temperature rising. Inside the tunnel, the heat was absolute. Miller felt his skin begin to prickle violently, a sensation like a million tiny needles driving into his pores. The air was so hot it burned his throat with every inhalation. Dust and flakes of rust fell from the ceiling, sticking to his sweating back and face. He wedged his right boot against a conduit clamp and shoved. His body slid forward another foot. His taped left shoulder scraped against the narrow wall, sending a blinding, white-hot spike of agony directly into his brain. He bit his tongue to keep from screaming, tasting copper in his mouth. 5 meters, Chloe announced. You are halfway, Miller. Please accelerate. Your vitals are slipping. Shut up, Miller hissed through his teeth, the sound barely audible over the comms. He kept moving. It wasn't about strength anymore. It was about simple, ugly endurance. The human capacity to endure suffering is not born of stoicism. It is born of spite. Miller hated the tunnel. He hated the heat. He hated the skitter cast. And he refused to let them win. Scrape, push, agony, repeat. 8 meters. Chloe's voice sounded distorted, warped by the static of the power cables. He is slowing down. Beatrix, his heart rate is at 200 beats per minute. He is going to code. Beatrix gripped the edge of the access hatch, her thick knuckles turning white. She leaned her face into the blistering heat of the tunnel. Miller, move! You are almost there! At the end of the shaft, Miller saw the valve. It was a massive, rusted iron wheel secured to a heavy steel pipe. The metal was radiating heat like a furnace. He reached it. He dragged his battered body into the tiny alcove at the end of the tunnel, contorting his spine to get his shoulders under the valve. He raised his right hand, gripping the wheel. It was incredibly hot, burning through the synthetic tape on his fingers in seconds. He pulled. The valve didn't budge. It was seized solid by decades of neglect and the recent thermal shock. Miller let out a frustrated, breathless sound. He needed leverage. He needed 2 hands. He looked down at his left arm, bound tightly to his ribs. If he moved it, he would tear the stitches completely. He would likely dislocate the joint again. The pain would be paralyzing. Miller, the valve! Beatrix yelled from the end of the tunnel. Miller closed his eyes. He thought about the cold, heavy gravity of Earth. He thought about the predators his ancestors had chased into exhaustion. He thought about the simple, terrifying biological imperative programmed into his DNA, survive, at any cost. He reached over with his right hand and ripped the structural tape away from his left arm. The skin underneath tore, blood immediately spilling freely down his flank. He let out a low, guttural snarl, ignoring the sickening pop of his damaged shoulder joint shifting in its socket. He reached up, forcing his left hand to grip the burning iron wheel alongside his right. Core temp critical, Chloe warned, pure panic bleeding into her synthesized voice. He is cooking! Miller planted his boots against the side of the alcove. He locked his jaw, and he pulled with everything he had. Muscle fibers tore, blisters popped against the hot iron. The smell of his own searing flesh filled his nostrils. But he didn't stop pulling. The human brain, flooded with a lethal dose of adrenaline and cortisol, simply muted the pain receptors. He was destroying himself to turn a wheel. With an ear-splitting metallic screech, the rust broke. The heavy valve groaned, slowly turning one full rotation, then another, then a third. Deep within the bowels of the ship, a massive resonant thud echoed through the hull, followed by the high-pitched whining crescendo of the FTL drive spooling up. "Bypass engaged," Chloe shouted over the comms. "Drive is igniting, spooling jump sequence in 3, 2, 1. The ship lurched, a sickening, momentary inversion of physics, as the Pilgrim tore a hole in space-time and vanished into the slipstream. Beatrix braced herself against the bulkhead, letting out a massive breath she didn't realize she was holding. "He did it," she whispered. She shoved her head back into the tunnel. The heat was already beginning to dissipate as the coolant lines flooded with fresh freon. "Miller!" she bellowed. "It is done! Pull back!" There was no answer. Beatrix clicked her flashlight on, sweeping the beam down the long, narrow shaft. Miller was slumped against the bulkhead at the end of the tunnel. His hands were still gripped loosely around the wheel. He wasn't moving. Beatrix felt a cold, jagged spike of terror pierce her heavy chest. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. She dropped to her stomach and shoved her massive, dense shoulders into the narrow 40-centimeter opening. The metal groaned in protest. Sharp edges dug into her thick skin, scraping away scales and drawing dark, viscous blood. She didn't care. She braced her powerful legs and pushed, forcing her bulk into a space designed for someone half her size. She crawled. She tore her own flesh to reach him, driven by a sudden, fierce loyalty to the broken, fragile thing in the dark. She reached the end of the tunnel, her shoulders hopelessly wedged against the corrugated walls. She reached out with one massive hand, grabbing Miller by the ankle of his heavy boot. "I have you," she rumbled, her voice echoing in the cramped space. She pulled, slowly, agonizingly, dragging his limp, unconscious body backward through the dirt, the heat, and the dark, back toward the light. Metal shrieked against dense bone as Beatrix forced herself backward out of the maintenance hatch. She hauled Miller's limp frame onto the deck grating. He felt entirely different now. Before, he had possessed a coiled, nervous energy, a tense rigidity that made him seem dense despite his frail biology. Now, he was just dead weight. He flopped onto the scarred metal floor, a ruined mess of torn bandages, blistered skin, and fresh, bright blood. Beatrix dragged her own bulk completely out of the tunnel. Her heavy shoulders were scraped raw. Dark, viscous blood oozed from the gaps in her thick dermal plates where the corrugated walls had violently chewed into her. She ignored the stinging pain. Joseph arrived with the hover stretcher, his translucent hands trembling violently as he maneuvered the repulsor lift beneath Miller. The pilot looked down at the human and actually gagged, slapping a hand over his mouth. The smell was atrocious. It was a suffocating cloud of seared meat, melted synthetic tape, and the sharp, sour tang of rapid tissue death. "Med Bay," Beatrix barked, her voice a low, exhausted rumble. "Now." The journey back up to the medical deck was a blur of flashing emergency lights and the sickening low-frequency hum of the FTL drive pushing them through hyperspace. Beatrix stumbled once, her dense legs finally betraying her, heavy with lactic acid and the sheer, crushing weight of coming down from an adrenaline high. She caught herself on the bulkhead, leaving a bloody handprint on the gray wall, and kept moving. They dumped Miller onto the surgical table. The ship's automated surgical dock whirred to life, its multi-jointed arms descending from the ceiling. It immediately began spraying his ruined hands and chest with a thick, foaming biogel to halt the thermal degradation. Beatrix backed into the corner of the small room, sliding down the cold wall until she sat heavily on the floor. She watched the machine work. She listened to the wet, mechanical sounds of the dock cutting away the charred flesh, suctioning blood, and stapling skin. Chloe's voice buzzed through the intercom, sounding thin and incredibly tired. "Reactor output is stable. We are secure in the slipstream. ETA to the Persephone core is 4 days." "Understood," Beatrix breathed. Joseph huddled near the diagnostic monitor, his eyes wide, watching the erratic spikes of Miller's heart rate. He is in deep shock. The autodoc is administering synthetic plasma, but his body is fighting it. His immune system is attacking the grafts. "Humans are stubborn," Beatrix murmured, resting her heavy head against the bulkhead. "His body will figure it out." She closed her eyes, letting the heavy, rhythmic vibration of the engines seep into her aching bones. For the first time since she had left the gravity-crushed surface of Acheron, she felt a profound, paralyzing sense of vulnerability. She had always relied on her mass, her density, her sheer physical superiority to solve problems. When the universe pushed, she pushed back harder. But down in that engineering bay, her mass had been useless. Her strength had been a liability. She couldn't fit into the dark. She couldn't reach the valve. Miller could. And he had destroyed himself to do it. He didn't have armor. He didn't have heavy bones. He had soft, pink skin and a central nervous system that screamed at him every time he moved. Yet, he had crawled into a 60-degree oven, ripped his own stitches open, and boiled his own hands to turn a rusted wheel. Beatrix opened her eyes and looked at the human on the table. He was wrapped in thick layers of white gauze, an oxygen mask strapped over his pale face. She wasn't the apex predator anymore. She was just the muscle. Miller was the survivor. Hyperspace travel has a distinct flavor. It tastes like static electricity and old tin, a byproduct of the massive electromagnetic fields shielding the ship from the chaotic physics of the slipstream. Beatrix sat in the mess hall, slowly chewing a cube of synthetic protein. Her shoulders were patched with dark, heavy scabs, the dermal plating slowly regenerating over the raw tissue. The ship was quiet, bathed in the soft blue illumination of standard cruising mode. The door to the galley hissed open. Miller walked in. He moved with the stiff, agonizing gait of an old man whose joints were full of broken glass. Both of his hands were encased in thick, bulky biogel casts that went up to his elbows. His left arm was strapped tightly in a newly fabricated carbon fiber sling. The skin of his face was peeling terribly, shedding the dead layers destroyed by the frostbite, leaving raw, pink patches underneath. He looked absolutely miserable. He smelled strongly of antiseptic foam and stale sweat. Beatrix watched him shuffle toward the rationing dispenser. He awkwardly bumped the large dispensing button with his elbow, catching the falling pouch of gray nutrient paste against his chest. He turned around, sighing heavily, and walked over to Beatrix's table. He kicked a chair out with his boot and dropped into it, letting out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain as his battered body settled. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the low thrum of the deck plates and Miller's slightly wheezy breathing. He stared at the pouch of paste on the table. Because of the heavy casts on his hands, he had no way to open it. He just looked at it, his jaw tight, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. He was hungry, he was exhausted, and he was completely, frustratingly helpless. Beatrix reached across the table. She took the pouch in her massive, dense hands, pinched the top, and tore the tough polymer open with a single, effortless twist. She slid it back across the table, propping it up against a metal salt shaker so he could drink from it without using his hands. Miller looked at the open pouch. Then he looked up at her. His fractured green eyes were bloodshot, tired beyond measure. "Thanks," he rasped. His voice sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. "You should be in the nutrient bath," Beatrix said, her voice dropping into its familiar, gravelly register. "I hate the bath," Miller muttered, leaning forward to suck some of the awful paste from the pouch. He grimaced, swallowing hard. "Tastes like dirty bath water. The paste is better." "You are a terrible liar." Miller managed a weak, cracked half-smile. "Yeah, but the bath is boring. I needed to walk, needed to make sure my legs still worked." Beatrix folded her heavy arms on the table. She looked at his encased hands. "Chloe says the nerve damage is extensive. You will need intensive synthetic grafts when we reach Persephone." "Not my first rodeo with grafts," he said, shifting his weight and wincing. "My right knee is mostly titanium, got a synthetic liver too. Earth biology is great at a lot of things, B, but regrowing parts ain't one of them. We just bolt new pieces on and keep walking." Beatrix frowned, the thick ridges of her brow knitting together. "Why do you do it? Your species. Why do you leave your world? You are so fragile. The galaxy is filled with things that can crush you effortlessly. I have watched you break your own body 3 times in the span of a week just to survive. Why not stay where it is safe?" Miller leaned back, resting his head against the metal bulkhead behind him. He closed his eyes, thinking. "Earth isn't safe," he said quietly. "Nothing is safe. Humans figured that out a long time ago. We realize the universe is fundamentally hostile. It wants to freeze you, or burn you, or crush you under a rock. So, you have 2 choices. You can hide in a cave and wait for the dark to get you." He opened his eyes, looking directly at her. "Or you can walk out into the dark with a heavy stick and make it respect you." Beatrix stared at him. She felt the heavy, undeniable truth in his words. Her people, the natives of Acheron, had survived their death world by evolving dense armor and crushing strength. They survived by becoming the hardest stones on the mountain. Humans had taken a different route. They didn't grow armor. They didn't grow claws. They just developed an absolute, terrifying refusal to die. They survived through sheer, unadulterated spite. "You are a lunatic," Beatrix said, her tone devoid of its usual arrogance. It sounded almost like reverence. Miller chuckled, a dry, painful sound that ended in a wet cough. "I'm a mechanic, B. Sometimes the machine breaks, and you just gotta hit it with a wrench until it works again, even if the machine is you." He leaned forward, awkwardly maneuvering his elbow to nudge the nutrient pouch closer. "Besides, I'm not the only one swinging a stick in the dark around here. I saw you pop that scrapper like a tick. You're pretty handy in a fight." Beatrix snorted, a deep, resonant sound. "I am a Category 9 Deathworlder. Combat is my biological imperative." "Sure it is," Miller smiled, his cracked lips bleeding slightly. "But you pulled me out of that tunnel. You didn't have to. You could have left me to cook, taken the ship, and gone home. But you wedged your big, dense ass in that pipe and dragged me out. That's not biology, B. That's a choice." Beatrix looked away, staring at the scarred surface of the table. She felt a strange, uncomfortable warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with ambient temperature. She had thought she was alone on this ship, a solitary beast burdened with the task of keeping fragile things alive. She had thought the human was just another piece of glass she had to protect from shattering. She looked back at Miller. He was currently trying to wipe a smudge of nutrient paste off his nose using the edge of his biogel cast, looking utterly ridiculous. He was fragile, he was broken, but he was undeniably the most dangerous thing on the Pilgrim. "Finish your paste," Beatrix ordered gently. "Then I am escorting you back to the med bay. If you resist, I will carry you." Miller stopped struggling with his nose and looked at her, his eyes softening. He didn't offer a snarky comeback. He just nodded slowly. "All right, boss," he said. "Lead the way." Beatrix stood up, her heavy boots thudding solidly against the deck grating. She didn't feel the crushing weight of isolation anymore. The freighter Pilgrim was a rust bucket floating through a hostile, unforgiving void, surrounded by monsters and cold, dead space. But as she walked down the corridor, listening to the slow, stubborn, agonizingly persistent footsteps of the human limping along behind her, Beatrix smiled. The monsters in the dark didn't stand a chance. If this journey through the dark with Beatrix and Miller kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you never miss our next sci-fi transmission. Share this video with fellow survivors who know what it takes to hold the line. Drop a comment below on what you think makes humans the ultimate Deathworlders. See you next time.